I can have your attention. I hope you're enjoying our jam-packed day. I know we've been keeping you guys busy, but you guys are awesome. You're sticking with us. I'm happy to introduce our next speaker this, afternoon, Mr. Sohrab Ahmari. Mr. Ahmari is the opinion editor of the New York Post, a columnist for First Things, and a contributing editor at the Catholic Herald. Previously, he served as a columnist and editor with the Wall Street Journal, opinion pages in New York and London, and as a senior writer at Commentary. In addition to those publications, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Times Literary Supplement, the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Spectator, Dissent, and America. Mr. Ahmari will be giving a talk entitled, Get in Your Pod, Surf Your Pornhub, Eat Your Cicadas, and Forget Your Past, American Dystopia and the Crisis of Historicity. Mr. Ahmari.
Thank you so much. As my friend Roger Kimball likes to say when he speaks at events like this where people are still eating, continue to masticate. Thank you all for having me, to Johnny and James and everyone else at ISI. This is my first ISI Honors Conference. We'll see if I get invited again. Thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure to get to meet you one-on-one, at least some of you. That was a wonderful opportunity as well. So I have to tell you the title that I gave was a publicity man's bit of misdirection. I'm not a scholar. I work at a tabloid, known for prurient, punny headlines. So I had to use what I could to maximize turnout for my talk. I am going to talk about American dystopia, but what's really missing is the cicadas. And the reason for that is that at the time Johnny asked me to give a title and a description for my talk, cicadas were all over news, not just in the greater Washington area, but just all over the East Coast. And you couldn't help but open the lifestyle sections of the New York Times or the Washington Post or what have you without running into some cicada wonton recipe. And so I was already averse to eating cicadas. And then I actually took a drive from New York to Washington for a conference not unlike this one and encountered the cicadas for the very first time. And as you're driving on a highway, most bugs, I apologize you're eating, but most bugs just kind of imperceptibly kind of squish against your, these things, it's like a grenade, hitting, oh, boom, and it leaves this lasting ooze on your car. And I thought, you know what, Fred Hyatt, you enjoy that. I'm not gonna. Anyway, so you will not hear about cicadas, but I do want to talk to you about my new book, the one that I'm beginning to write, not the one that's in front of you on your tables, which is a more contemporary book. And I thought maybe it's a treat to give you a prologue for it, but that by definition means that it's a little bit less polished. It's a little bit more organic. You're getting to see the book at its very early stages. And so happy to share that with you and see what you think. So I apologize. I normally would give a more organic talk, but I'm going to read off of it because it's new material, as it were. So I begin saying that those who inhabit the very online right, as I do, know that we like to point to how this or that new social phenomenon resembles this or that dystopian fiction. It's a beloved meme genre. So, for example, the American Medical Association declares, as it really in fact did, that sex shouldn't be listed on birth certificates, as in fact it did. And we can't help comparing this to 1984, to Winston being compelled to renounce reality itself. These memes reflect a broader tendency. Our culture creators are highly adept at prophesying dystopia, and we love to nod along as their premonitions come to life. But we can't seem to stop the process. As my friend Patrick Deneen has observed, quote, our popular culture seems to be a kind of electronic Cassandra. It offers entertaining prophecies born of our anxieties, and we take perverse pleasure distracting ourselves with portrayals of our powerlessness. In my new book, the one I'm just beginning to write, I take this observation as a point of departure and argue that conservatives must put the dystopian imagination to more productive uses than mere mimetics. More provocatively, I contend that dystopia has already happened. It's already here. Our territory now conforms to the maps drawn long ago by our sci-fi authors. We've crossed the invisible frontier that divides an ordinary place, an ordinary topos, from a dystopian realm. If that's the case, then the imagined futures of the past are a better guide to the present than any think tank white paper. Novelists can be so much more far-seeing and be so much wiser than most of the people engaged in take work in our think tanks. Those who would tell us that we live in the best of all possible worlds because flat-screen televisions are so cheap. By casting a serious literary glance at our realities, or perhaps I should say at our unrealities, we can shake off such complacency and resist the temptation to presentism. The best dystopian literature, moreover, can reveal the deeper currents shaping our age, and that in turn can help us understand why we feel so powerless, as Patrick says. Or let's be honest, it's powerlessness that's brought us here. From the last summer to this one, we've faced what seems like a series of revolutionary paroxysms. The lockdowns, the mainstreaming of critical race theory, big tech's definitive turn toward censorship, the escalation of woke capital's intrusions into the democratic process, and so on. And of course, the George Floyd riots and the anti-historical iconoclasm that attended them. ISI has selected that last as our theme for this conference, and wisely so. The widespread destruction of public memorials, the tearing down of certified American heroes and saints, the raising up in their place of a nihilistic pseudo-history, the feeling of ahistoricity that all this risks creating, particularly among young people growing up in cities literally denuded of heroes and memories. In response to all this, we should, of course, applaud all the people who are fighting to tell the truth about our history in all its rich complexity and to offer correctives to the nonsense. But the more interesting task, to my mind, is to figure out whether this iconoclastic frenzy of the last year really represents something new and revolutionary, or whether what we're dealing with is merely the acceleration of older and deeper processes of ideological transformation. And if the latter is the case, then we have to wonder at the material forces driving the change at the superstructural level, or at least cooperating with it, and to discern the actual material logic. It seems to me that we can't begin to properly counter the iconoclasm without untangling these knots. We need a material diagnosis. So to do that, I propose to visit a place called Eden Olympia. Have any of you been there? Well, I don't blame you because it's a fictional business park in the south of France, the setting for one of J.G. Ballard's last novels, Super Can, published in 1999. Our protagonists are Dr. Jane Sinclair, a British pediatrician hired to replace one of the park's physicians, and her husband, Paul, a pilot convalescing from a plane crash. Eden Olympia recruited Jane because her predecessor in the job, another Brit named Dr. David Greenwood, has gone postal, shooting up 10 colleagues before turning many of them senior executives at the park, before turning his gun on himself. And as Jane gets absorbed into her work at the park, Eden Olympia is a sort of playground for workaholics, not unlike real-world counterparts in Silicon Valley or the leafy suburbs of Seattle. It falls to the jobless Paul to unravel what really happened with Greenwood. What led a gentle pediatrician to murder innocents in cold blood? Or perhaps Greenwood's victims weren't so innocent. I won't spoil the plot for you, I promise. Well, actually I will, but sorry. It's a magnificent novel, a delightful mix of noir and science fiction and social commentary. What matters for our purposes is Eden Olympia itself, this business park, which is as much a character in its own right as Ballard's human characters. It's a place where executives from, and he names real corporations, are all there doing important informatic work, managing supply chains halfway around the world, designing new buildings in the case of the architects, designing new factories and so forth, but it's all work that involves manipulation of information on screens. What are the chief characteristics of Eden Olympia? I'd like to focus on three which are closely bound up with each other. Let me know if they strike you as uncannily familiar. They certainly did for me. I first read the novel in the early 2000s, and then I reread it as I began to write this book. The first feature is an obsession with bodily health. It turns out that in addition to more routine duties, Jane is expected to help Eden Olympia create a park-wide medical diagnostic system. As she tells her husband, every morning when they get up, people will dial the clinic and log in their health data. pulse, blood pressure, weight, and so on. One prick of the finger on a small scanner, and computers here will analyze everything: liver enzymes, cholesterol, prostate markers, and the lot. Her boss, she goes on, is very keen on fecal smears, but I suspect that's one test too far. He hates the idea of all that used toilet paper going to waste. The greatest diagnostic tool in the world is literally flushed down the lavatory. Imagine if Dr. Fauci could amass such technology and power. Paul asks, "No one will ever get ill, right?" And Jane replies, something like that. Later, we learn that Jane is, quote, running a new computer model tracing the spread of nasal viruses across Eden Olympia. She has a hunch that if people move their chairs a further 18 inches apart, they'd stop the infections right in their tracks. Ballard quite literally foresaw social distancing 2 decades before anyone had heard of the novel coronavirus. Although even with his dystopian prescience, he couldn't foresee the rise of universal, permanent masking as a sort of medical hijab among the Western laptop classes. And again, we get Paul's sarcastic aside in response to this. I thought people were already too far as it is. A term frequently flung around Eden Olympia is corporate puritanism. It captures both the absolute workaholism of the park's professional managerial class and its disgust with the ordinary grime and messy civic give and take of the outside world. Now, this puritanism coexists in another prophetic flourish from Ballard, I think, with a kind of controlled hedonism. In those all-true brief hours when the executives don't work, they get kinky, to put it mildly, hard drugs, sadomasochism, and even random ultra-violence directed against the people outside the park. We will return to this transgressive impulse. But to understand it, we have to attend to the other major features of Eden Olympia. The second one is that it's a profoundly anti-political place. Here, I want to briefly pause and note that Sophia Antipolis is the name of an actual Silicon Valley business park in southern France, mentioned in Ballard's work. It's an ancient Greek name for nearby Antibes, but Antipolis also literally means literally opposite the city, so therefore opposite Nice. But the ancient name also happens to be nicely evocative of what these business parks are like to Ballard's mind. Anti-polises, anti-cities, the opposite of what the ancient city represented. The ideal city as a family of families, a political community, a space for cultivating civic virtue. Quote, "An invisible infrastructure took the place of traditional civic virtues," Paul tells us. At Eden Olympia, there were no parking problems, no traditional burglars or purse snatchers, no rapes or muggings. The top-drawer professionals no longer needed to devote a moment's thought to each other and had dispensed with the checks and balances of community life. There were no town councils or magistrates' courts, no citizens' advice bureau. Civility and polity were designed into Eden Olympia in the same way that mathematics, aesthetics, and an entire geopolitical worldview was designed into the Parthenon and the Boeing 747. Representative democracy had been replaced by the surveillance camera and the private police officer. Again and again, Eden Olympia's architects drive home this point. In a chilling exchange, Paul tells one executive that there's no drama and no conflict here. There are no clubs or evening classes. The executive answers, "We don't need them. They serve no role. No charities, no church fetes, no fundraising galas. Everyone is rich, or at least very well off. No police or legal system. There is no crime, no social problems. No democratic accountability, no one votes. So who runs things?" And he responds, "We do. We run things." At Eden Olympia, the private has somehow completely swallowed and corroded the public, eaten it from the inside out. Morality, if it can be called that, is baked into ergonomics. You don't debate great public issues or allow the ancient rivalry between classes to play out in a real political way. There are cameras everywhere and a private police force to respond when the executives think something has gone wrong or there's an irregularity or abnormality. Again, Ballard's prophetic here. For us, morality, insofar as it exists, is increasingly programmed into our smartphones. Things no longer get debated, but algorithms ensure that we are steered away from quote-unquote extremist ideas, the definition of which is ever shifting according to the needs of the regime. There's no public moral culture, no institutions to sustain it. To the extent that a vestigial public realm exists, It is totally devoted to serving the needs and preferences of one class, the owners of capital and the high-end professionals who work for them. Which brings us to the third feature. Eden Olympia has no progeny and no past. Not long after they arrive, Jane and Paul cease conjugal relations. Jane works too hard. She has no time. When Paul suggests they have a baby, Jane says, "That's rather clever, Paul, but I can't, at least not now. There are problems." And of course, he knows that she has an IUD meant to ensure marital sterility. And indeed, in the entire park, there are no children, none. One executive tells Paul, "Today's corporate city is superbly talented, adult, and virtually childless. You define yourself by the kind of trainers you wear." So much for progeny. As for the past, well, it doesn't exist. The executives of the park, as you might expect, are quite diverse. This is a multicultural place. Its professional ranks are drawn from Britain, France, the United States, Mexico, Japan, and so on. But there's nothing particularly British or French or American or Mexican or Japanese about them. Rather, what unites them, as one critic of the park puts it to Paul, is that they're all, quote, paid-up members of the new elite. They're the corporate chosen people, end quote. As the park expands, it literally destroys the history, natural and man-made, of the surrounding community. Paul observes, quote, "The site contractors were already at work, clearing holm oaks and umbrella pines that had endured since Roman times, surviving forest fires and barbarian invasions. Nature, as the new millennium dictated, was giving way for the last time to the tax shelter and the corporate car park," end quote. And interestingly, Jane embraces this sentiment. From a classical Marxist frame, she's someone who has true class consciousness, a member of a professional class that is for itself in the Marxist language. She hasn't thought about it that deeply, but she somehow understands that the ahistoricity of the place is good for people like her, for people in her class, for their success. Eden Olympia, she tells Paul, quote, "has a lot going for it. It's open to talent and hard work. There's no ground already staked out, no title deeds going back to bloody Magna Carta. You feel anything could happen," end quote. She's expressing the dream of total meritocracy. Places that have deeds going back to bloody Magna Carta impose inherited obligations. They're messy, they're small d democratic, they entertain competing claims, there's memory, there are ancient authorities. All this stands in the way of the global meritocrat. And where these messy competing claims, not least the claims of the poor, the small property holder, etc., arise, Eden Olympia wages literal class war. I mentioned that the executives find a kind of sexual release in ultraviolence. They go on these hunting parties, they call them ratissage, raking over, where they beat up local prostitutes, immigrants, tourists, and so on. People who in some way or other still represents the older world that stands in the way of the omnipresent car park. One thing that's off here, the one point in which Ballard's powers of prophecy failed them, is that the executives have this undercurrent of hard-right nationalist politics. Some are members of the National Front, which was a lot more, even more nasty, let's say, in 1999. And they think of themselves as waging war against quote-unquote undesirable elements. Of course, the real counterparts of the Eden Olympia executives today would absolutely steer clear of anything like Marine Le Pen's party. These people delight in labor arbitrage, both in the form of offshoring and immigration. Nevertheless, I do think Ballard is right in the main in his analysis of class violence and war required to realize the professional managerial class's dream world. Now let me circle back to the first feature of Eden Olympia, that is, its obsession with bodily health. Here, Ballard's prescience is just off the charts, enough to induce goosebumps. The program of ratissage, of these vicious human hunting parties, was instituted as a mechanism to deal with the executives' otherwise inexplicable physical ailments, mainly respiratory conditions. These men and women, who otherwise strenuously exercise and watch their calories and eat kale, would suddenly be seized with respiratory illnesses. I call them the ailments of anti-political or apolitical man. Something about this apolitical, ahistorical way of life literally makes the executive sick. And to fend off the condition, they have to enact violence against people who still inhabit the old political, historical, embodied reality that is part of human nature. it cures their respiratory issues. Now let me be even more on the nose and tie all this together with our present condition. I think we're living in a kind of Eden Olympia, writ large, or rather, we are in a stage of transition, a shift between, on the one hand, a vestigial world of still embodied communities inhabited by political animals with historical memories, and on the other, the nightmarish utopia of Eden Olympia. Note here, the name is both biblical and classical, suggesting a religious mythic utopia, or non-place, which, when established in the real world is, of course, a dystopia. The revolutions that so worry us today, and justifiably so, the things that have brought us here today to discuss the anti-historical trend in American society, are symptoms of this historical passage. Note the elements of Ballard's dystopia and then compare them to ours. So, bodily obsession, social distancing, the dream of a world without grime, without sweat and sense, and the germs of other human beings. Of course, as Ballard reminds us, such a world serves the material interests of some classes and disserves those of others. The laptop class generates value by manipulating information on screens, and it looks with bewilderment and not a little contempt at two groups especially that it sees as vestigial: small property holders and what I've called tangible workers in another context. What to do with them? Ideally, all that kind of labor and value generation would be automated, relegated to drones, e-tailers, and so on. But the intangibles class, or the laptop class, still needs tangible labor. Silicon Valley, as my friend Michael Lind reminds us, can't do all it does without massive storage and power generation facilities spread across the heartland and maintained by the working class, by tangible labor. Eden Olympia needs farmers and restaurants and nannies and high-end escorts. Now enter COVID-19, a real crisis, but also a tremendous opportunity to squeeze the tangibles class, to discipline it, to transfer as much of its livelihood as possible to virtual realms controlled by the laptop class. An incredible opportunity for an upward transfer of wealth. And of course, the added benefit of social distancing, literally enacting distance between people and classes, a separation symbolized by the medical hijab and the plexiglass barrier. Why won't they let the damn virus go? Why won't they let us move on? Because class war is carried out in many ways. Second, the general anti-political thrust of Eden to Olympia that today I think finds expression in big tech censorship, of course. As you know, we at the New York Post went through probably the most chilling case of this, where I woke up, I think the morning of October 14th, and I hadn't checked our front page the night before in our kind of pagination system, so I woke up and look at our front page, and it's this big story about Hunter Biden. And everyone's talking about it. And then at 10 o'clock, we saw a Facebook operative, a PR man for Facebook, who happened to openly proclaim in his online biography that he formerly worked for Senator Barbara Boxer and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He said, we've seen that troubling Hunter Biden story in the New York Post. Until further fact-checking, we're taking steps to reduce circulation on it. And then Twitter banned it from being publicly shared, and then people were asking you, what's this story that you can't share? I tried to send it to them in private messages, and you couldn't send it in private messages either. And as you know, the entire media class, with honorable few exceptions like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, lined up behind the censorship. They claimed that it was Russian disinformation with zero evidence. And you had 50 former intelligence officials going on the record saying, although they haven't examined any of the evidence or any of the things that the New York Post had examined, this story contains all the indicia of Russian disinformation. Now, bear in mind that at least used to be in my profession and Dan's profession that the press was supposed to have an adversarial relationship with intelligence agencies that can drone people out of the sky, but somehow they all said, oh yes, General Hayden, it's Russian disinformation, and it slipped away. And now we know that, as a Pew poll revealed, a marginal share of Americans would have changed their vote had they known about the Hunter Biden story, but big tech's successful attempt to suppress the story meant that they hadn't accessed the story. And of course, elections in this country are won by on small margins after all. So who knows what would have happened had they not taken this step. But I mention this point because it is no longer the kind of democratic debate that in the American political tradition was taken for granted, and so much of it is empowered, and Eden Olympia and in our pseudo-dystopia today is empowered by private tyranny. Our traditions, and we'll talk about this perhaps in the question and answer as well, are so geared toward checking public tyranny that they are incredibly vulnerable to private tyranny. That could be the private tyranny that one person exercises over himself through an opioid addiction, or in the case of big tech, just a few Silicon Valley dweebs with their Birkenstocks removing from vast swaths of the internet a story that appeared in a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, the oldest continuously published daily newspaper in our country. 5 people, or however many it is, got to decide to do that. If there is a better symbol of how private tyranny has hollowed out the public, has hollowed out the promise of our traditions, I can't think of one. I also argue that the fundamentally anti-political urge today, or impulse, finds expression in all the PC language regulation that conservatives are rightly worried about. Conservatives detect behind the expansion of PC language regulation and so-called cancel culture the sinister hand of leftist American scholars, themselves reared on exotic continental theories like postmodernism and deconstruction. And there is some truth to that. But this interpretation risks obscuring a larger, more important truth. Cancel culture is in some ways the new factory discipline. There is little resembling demands for ongoing redistributive justice of the kind that the old left championed. No labor solidarity, nothing to do with wages and job security. Just demands for quote-unquote representation or diversity on corporate boards, in university curricula, etc. And of course, the firing of those who say the wrong thing or the awkward thing in the digital public square, in workplaces or in the classroom. The goal isn't to rectify concrete economic injustices as an old democratic left would have understood. Massive inequalities in wealth, health, and job security, or what have you. The goal is precisely the opposite. It's to mitigate, to defer, to smooth over, to mask these substantive disagreements and instead have battles on procedural mechanisms for upholding manners. Now, which social class most excels at politically correct manners? That would be the professional managerial class, the laptop class. It's the Eden Olympia class. Its children learn the patois for discussing quote-unquote issues of race, gender, and sexuality from an early age. They're expected to have mastered it by the time they take their entry-level jobs. It's a skill that private schools are doubtless teaching already. Working class people, meanwhile, are most likely to struggle with this language. Even when they mean well, they don't always get it right, not least because the rules constantly shift with the vagaries of critical race theory and LGBT acronyms. By fortifying the requirements to speak and think correctly and raising the stakes for failures, the neoliberal class has now built a repressive new mechanism for staying at the top and keeping the oiks down. Lastly, and again we come back to what is a theme for our conference, and the problem that's of greatest import to us is that quality of ahistoricity. And here again, the conservative diagnosis is not incorrect. It's true, but it obscures a larger truth. If critical race theory and the desecration and destruction of historical memory really threatened the interests of Jeff Bezos, Apple Corporation, Nike, the trustees of Ivy League universities, Brooks Brothers, and so on, do you really think they would ally themselves with these forces? Don't be naive. They would shut it down like that. And it isn't just the fact that wokesters trained by disciples of Judith Butler have somehow captured the corporate establishment, although that's certainly a part of it, and I experience that daily working in the media. But again, the larger truth that risks being obscured is that the bringing about of Eden Olympia demands ahistoricity. People who have historical memories have heroes, they have romantic ideals, they have authorities that guide their individual consciences, they have religion, they have national pride. Family and community and nation form the warp and weft of their characters. People who don't have such things make the perfect corporate subjects, be they the ones who occupy the commanding heights of Eden Olympia or the ones who toil on its peripheries. All this brings us to perhaps a bitter conclusion, and it is this. Conservatives can bang on and on about how Lincoln was actually a liberator and not a horrid racist. And it won't do much good when it runs up against the inner logic of our society, against this historical material force, the drive toward Eden Olympia. One more think piece won't save us, including the one that I'm reading to you. Today's culture war can't be reduced to a material substrate, that's true, but we discount the material, class-based, and political economy dimensions at our peril, especially so in an essentially bourgeois commercial empire. So how to link the culture war to class war and successfully prevail is a discussion for another day. I've come to favor Lynn's theory of countervailing power basically as how you do this in the United States, is you have to build up the working class, the tangible class, whatever you want to call it, and it is absolutely multiracial, and it is drawn to populist politics at margins that really terrify the kind of uniparty elites. They're drawn to that, so there's an opportunity there. But that means that conservatives cannot fight this battle just on the realm of takes, of getting retweets, of writing articles, all as important as that work is, and it's how I make a livelihood. Ballard, of course, was writing dystopian noir, and in noir there's never any political solution. The noir protagonist typically peers behind the glossy surface of a society and finds ugly class warfare and oppression churning there behind the sleek surface. But going back to Chandler, he can't finally muster any kind of political action or mass movement to alter the course of history, to alter material reality. He escapes the dystopia altogether, be that through Harrison Ford's Decker in Blade Runner, or he goes on a rampage, as Paul does in Supercan ultimately. Recapitulating David Greenwood's Righteous Massacre, he realizes why this doctor went on this killing spree, because the people who run Eden Olympia are evil. And so he amasses ammunition and prepares, and the book ends up with him preparing to go on a similar kind of postal killing spree. Dystopian noir is romantic. We can't afford romance. But a serious study of fantastical literature can sometimes help tear down our own fantasies. Thank you very much.
3 questions. So first come, first serve. Oh.
You can do more. You can do more. 5, yeah. All right.
So it's probably on all of our minds. How are we? Did you hear that?
Not the beginning, sorry.
Yeah, anyways, thank you so much for the lecture. What's probably on all of our minds today, after listening to that kind of bleak picture narrative of what's happening now, I'd say accurate. How do we survive?
How do we save the West in 5 minutes by Sohrab Ahmari? Look, in other contexts, it may not be part of this book in such an explicit way, but I think that the goal should be the goal of any society should be the one set out by kind of classical and Christian thought. The statesman's role is to form a virtuous citizenry, and that takes not just exhortations to virtue, but material conditions and laws that conduce for ordinary people, not the intellectuals, not the clerisy, but ordinary people to be able to live relatively decent lives of virtue. That means that and genuine human flourishing, and that happens in families, it happens in political community, it happens in small democratic give and take. A lot of this stuff is lost. So what I'm trying to say is that so much of conservatism these days is a kind of lamentation for things that are lost, like, oh, the family formation rate is so low. Oh, the church-going rate is so low, especially among the working class. Oh, the marriage rates and so on and so forth. And so what they're doing there is exhorting people to virtue. They're saying, come on, the aims that they've set out are good ones. What I argue, and I think what I place myself within a larger cohort of thinkers called the New Right, or the post-liberal right, is that in order for people to achieve that, for ordinary people, you have to have material conditions and laws that are supportive of that. And it's really not, I could go into concrete examples, but our more kind of libertarian-minded friends make it sound like if you do these things, for example, I would propose, just one example, is I would propose the restoration of a day of Sabbath, which could be religiously inclusive depending on what a worker's religious traditions hold or what their choice might be. But if you restore all that, you would be inviting just the worst possible tyranny. And the fact is, so that when they do that, they make even our liberal polity sound like it was a totalitarianism up until 10 years ago. Well, obviously, as you know, Sabbatarianism is a tradition going back in this country to kind of the pre-colonial era. And the idea was that not only that people need a day of rest and restoration where they spend time with God, with contemplative things, with family, with scripture, but that it gives workers a break. And what it meant in practice is, the opportunity to, for especially working class people to spend time one day a week with their kin. And the loss of that has paradoxically been, has resulted, not just for us who are in the kind of laptop class where you're constantly working and there's no break, but for, let's say, the Amazon worker who they use what's called algorithmic human resources management. And it's solely designed to minimize labor costs, just the exact number that you need, and therefore it produces absolute chaos in the life of the person who's on the sharp end of it, the worker. And so then, you have, Mr. Bowtie conservative being like, oh, the family formation rates, she's at work not being able to spend time with her children because there's never any regularity to her schedule. So that's the kind of frame of mind is what I suggest is, one, have a goal, and that goal is, broadly speaking, just ordinary lives of virtue for ordinary people. And, how do you achieve that? Be open not just to exhortation, but to using what power is meant for, which is to help form a virtuous citizenry. So that means the exercise of laws, order to that. It means, in some cases it means disciplining capital. In some cases, it might mean disciplining labor, by the way, right? So a statesman or woman who's dealing with with this object in mind, in some cases, for example, in public schools, realizes that in that case, labor has become the source of disorder, and so therefore there's a demand for discipline there. But in many cases today, it's capital. And it's professional managerial kind of service class that need to be disciplined because they're so kind of rapacious and indifferent to the plight of the nation as a whole, especially working class people. So you just be a little bit open to that. So in that sense, there's also an element in my thinking about this stuff of Matthew Arnold in Culture and Anarchy, which is a very important book to me. And it's this just simple observation, which is so valuable, where he's addressing the commercial classes in Britain. And, he says, growth is good, definitely. But also, it's causing urban blight. How do we limit it? Your principle of growth cannot be the only, governing principle. It's an important one. Just balance it against the other. But I think with kind of the current, especially the Anglo-American liberal regime, it's just so single-minded about certain things in the realm of political economy or in the realm of corporate governance and so forth, where one principle becomes a fetish at the expense of many others. So when people say, oh, Sohrab, Ahmari, authoritarians, we had a more kind of economically mixed regime not too long ago. Your grandparents did not live under a tyranny for having grown up there. So it's a kind of just a balance, a little bit of more balance. And I think it's useful to look at Michael Lind's theme especially of countervailing power, that U.S. history has often been marked with really sharp class antagonisms, and when it's done well is when You've had this kind of triad formation of labor, capital, and government sitting around the table and dialoguing with each other with what he calls cultural watchdogs in the background, the church, the synagogue, disciplining them on moral questions. Again, that's an arrangement that we've had in this country, so it's not such an outlandish step forward. It just means discarding some orthodoxies that have turned into fetishes. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I feel like I've met you at a different event.
Yes, I was at the Opus Dei thing.
You're like one of those professional conservative students. I love it. Yeah.
So I was the only non-Catholic, I think, at the retreat.
Okay.
So probably why you remember me. Okay. So in your presentation, you spoke about the left's obsession with physical health.
Yeah.
However, today we see more and more an obsession on the right, at least the online right, with physical appearance, i.e., physique checks, chads, and alpha males.
Yeah.
Do you think this obsession with aesthetics is healthy for the right?
That's a really good question. First of all, I would slightly correct. It's not the left. I'm trying to get away from the language of describe because I do think there is an honorable tradition of a small d democratic left whose loss and whose replacement with this kind of woke neoliberal order that is perfectly comfortable with big capital, with big tech, but also has these kind of pseudo-radical views. It's a tragedy that we've lost like just Gebhardt or something, just a union guy. Just no one you can think of anymore in that category. So maybe Joe Manchin, I don't know. But on the whole, the loss of that, so that's just a language thing, but I try to not say the left because it's not. It's this kind of uniparty neoliberal elite. You'll find it in the Tory party in Britain as well, so it's not kind of easy left-right. But the alternative on the right, you're right, some version of it has been like working out. I don't know, I work out, I run. I smoke, but I also run. I try to have the two counteract each other. Like I will spin for 45 minutes, and then when my bronchioles are especially receptive, I stuff them full of tobacco smoke. But no, I don't. I think the realm of aesthetics it's important if it points us to if the beauty, I suppose, points us to goodness and truth and a sounder political order. But that weird kind of like obsessive online right workout stuff, I just think it's just memes. It's just mimetics. It's not attached to what political goal does that accomplish? I don't understand. I mean, I'm glad people are healthy, but what is the? Do you know what I mean? Like, and I saw one recently where it's like it was a meme, and I love the brainlet memes. I don't know if you know where it's like but. It was like, if you're obese, I don't want to hear your views. I'm like, well, I don't know. Arguably, like, Chesterton was obese. Thomas Aquinas was described as, Magnus in corpore, large in body. I want to hear what they had to say, so that's argument over. And I should respond with a brainlet meme. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. You here referred to, and have in other places I know, referred to the idea of the multiracial working class as a counterweight to this kind of dystopian future. But a couple things on that. First, it's often not exactly the multiracial working class that votes for Trump and other populists. It's often like provincial upper middle class, small business owners, and sort of downwardly mobile middle class. And then also how, if you're going to have countervailing power, you will need countervailing elites. And how do we build countervailing elites when our elite institutions have been completely captured by this corrupt class that you've identified?
Yeah. I think that in 2021 you have to expand your definition of working class because it's not the age of Victorian newly industrializing with orphan chimney sweepers and metal buckets and for lunch buckets as they used to call them. It's not that age anymore. So the people who do various kinds of work, I think could be swept up in the definition of what I call the kind of tangibles class. That's one of the key themes of this book. I have to do some serious research, I mean, including some quantitative research, but people who, generally speaking, still toil with material reality one way or another. And if you think about it that way, the small holder who's a landlord, smaller landlord, not a corporate landlord, the person who repairs roofs, the person who, and I would say maybe nurses and so forth would fall into that group. So that's the first question. The second half was how to deal with universities being captured by elite institution being captured.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to need elites to counter their power.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think I'm constantly torn between and we were talking about this with Johnny on the podcast, do we build up our own alternative institutions like Thomas Aquinas College and Hillsdale and the like, or do we hope that your successors who are sitting in this we've stuffed them all into Ivies to try to get them to get into the main sort of what Charles Murray calls the narrow elite. It's about 100,000 Americans who really are and get them to, you could really change the nature of the country. I'm torn. I don't have any, it was such a difficult question. I wish I could direct some of our kind of conservative billionaires to pour money into these smaller colleges like TAC and Hillsdale and others so that they become really sort of unassailable credentialing institutions because it's such an age of credentials, the way that the Ivies are. That would be one way. And then encourage others to maybe go the traditional route and, integrate from within, as my friend Adrian would say.
All right, Thank you very much.
Speaking of integrating, is it all right if I ask you about the kind of the Catholic integralist movement? It has nothing to do with
sure.
Okay, yeah. So Mr. McCarthy, in the course of his talk, he talked about the kind of the ratio legis for the Establishment Clause was that there was already a deeply rooted and entrenched historical circumstance of regional religion, and so there's not going to be at the federal level. That is no longer true. As you very well know, over half the country doesn't go to church at all. I mean, amongst Catholics, there's a large problem of church attendance. I mean, the United States has a majority of the porn websites in the world are like rooted in the United States. Like we have a real big cultural problem, deviating or emanating from the fact that we're living in a post-Christian society. Of course, the fact that there's a historical circumstance for something, that doesn't mean that there's in principle any reason why we couldn't have a national religion or like an establishment of religion. But where I kind of have my own drawbacks or holdbacks, and this is something I've talked about with a number of friends who are liberal and who are like not religious at all, is how that could or could not impinge on free exercise. Obviously, establishment and free exercise are different because they're two separate clauses within the First Amendment, but I was wondering your thoughts on that, how I might be able to explain that to them, and kind of the case for Catholic integralism while respecting free exercise, especially among people who don't believe in anything at all.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the term political Catholicism because integralism is in part because it's linked to movements in the first half of the 20th century that were legitimately odious, and I have no brief for them, so to speak. I mean, I think what does political Catholicism mean in an American context like the one you described? Like you said, I mean, I could mention a lot more depressing facts about, the fact that like 90% of boys encounter hardcore porn before they hit puberty. I can tell you about church attendance across denominations, so on and so forth. It's all very very grim black pill. So what does that mean in such a context? For me, it kind of goes back to what I said about making it at least possible for the law. There is a reason why we're here, and I think it's the conceptual mistake has been to think that all of that is a product of something called culture or something called religion, which is innocent of any political dynamics, which is not warped by how people work and how they earn their living. It's just its own autonomous thing, and so we have to work on that, separate from what we do with the. Of course, that's. It seems even as I describe it, it seems very. It's an unsound set of assumptions to begin with. But if you have that kind of capacious view, say, well, yeah, of course the laws affect how people, whether they believe or whether their faith is sustainable. For me, in an American context in which, as you said, it has an establishment clause, it has and an irreligious society. Catholic integralism in practice might mean these steps that you can discuss with people to make their lives a little bit easier, and so to create conditions in which the church can then to do its work. So I'm increasingly, especially in this book, trying to marry politically Catholic commitments to, let's say, Michael Lind's critiques of the political economy, to say, okay, yes, we have an establishment clause, but we have had, for example, a Sabbatarian tradition that's been upheld repeatedly by the Supreme Court as not violative of the, or yes, we can ban pornography because that we've had obscenity laws going back to the colonial era. We've had them since the founding. We've had federal obscenity laws and so forth. So we just decided not to apply them to the internet relatively recently. So Catholic integralism in some ways might just look like traditional social conservatism. And on any given concrete battle, Catholic integralists or political Catholics and other elements of the new right or even of the broader right will find themselves in the trenches together, similarly. But you do have this ultimate goal, which they may not share, which is that, look, there will always be some altar enshrined in the public square. And so it's not a choice. You'll never have a neutral public square. So if you, as a Catholic political actor, your ultimate aim might be that the true God is worshipped, that the right altar is installed in the public square. But what you do on a day-to-day political combat basis might be something that you can share with Protestants, you can share with traditional Jews and others, and leave the rest to Providence.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmari, for your lecture. You've mentioned and well expressed the dangers of the professional laptop class. Yeah. However, I suspect that many young conservatives and even some of us in this room, given our background, our interest in ideas, might be tempted to, in some ways, live our lives as if we were members of that laptop class.
You are members of that class.
Exactly,
whether you like it or
yes,
not.
sir.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to us in order to help us live politically rooted lives? You've mentioned the Sabbath, but yeah. I guess there are others.
I don't know. That's a really good question because the temptation is to be like, go to your local union club and it'll be awkward. And I don't know what, look, but is it as a journalist, is it important to know American society up and down, left and right? Yes, okay. But if that's what you want to do, it would be good for a journalist to be exposed to broad swaths of society. But I don't want to, fetishize, as it were, a kind of and there is an element of that in that the other question that mentioned the Chad Jimbro. There's also this kind of just work out, man, and work on your car. And yeah, there's value in that. And working on your car is a useful way to combat a kind of Gnostic temptation of disembodied. There's a physical thing I can do to fix it. I couldn't fix my own car, but I'll have to find some other ways to have a kind of anti-Gnostic element in my life. But so that's my bottom line. Is I don't think you should seek to. You can personally ground yourself. You will, no matter what you are, you're a member of the elite. Just by the fact that you're in this room, what you will do with your life will almost certainly involve manipulating information on a screen rather than toiling with your hands. And you're not going to change that. And a weekend, spent fixing your car is nice and has value, but it's not going to change that. So what we want is elites who are just a little bit more attentive to the needs of the working class, of that broad working class, not to turn them into, this kind of Dorothy Day-ish stuff has no appeal to me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmari.